Welcome to That Pennsylvania Witch podcast. My name is Caitlin Dawn. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to chat with you.
For listeners who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your journey from a young person interested in mythology and then becoming such a prolific writer?
Sure. So, kind of two intertwined stories here, I guess. I grew up secular agnostic, so I wasn't raised with any specific religion. When I was 10 or 11, my best friend at the time had gotten a copy of Scott Cunningham's Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. I read it and I loved it because to me, everything was just like, well, this makes so much sense. Clearly, if there's like a divine masculine, there should be a divine feminine and a divine everything else in between going on. It should be more options. Than just kind of the one. I had always believed in the good folk and fairies and spirits and all that. So finding a spirituality where all of that was accepted and it was just like, well, this is, of course, part of reality just really clicked for me. And I had grown up in the Irish American diaspora. So to me, it just seemed logical. Well, if you're going to be a witch, if you're going to be pagan, of course, you're going to look at the Irish gods and goddesses and all of that. And then it led to me really kind of doing a deep dive on Irish folklore and Irish mythology when I was in my later teens just because I wanted that extra context. I wanted to really understand. And I had gotten into paganism in the 90s, which is like the worst era for pagan books, I think. No criticism. There are good authors from that era as well, but there was a lot that was coming out that was just like people were making a lot of things up. And then, presenting it to the world as like this is accurate, traditional Irish in particular belief. They'd usually call it Celtic, but it was almost always actually Irish is what they were talking about. So I kind of on my own started really digging into it and researching it. And that eventually led me to joining a Celtic Reconstructionist Druid order, which I realize sounds a little contradictory. Because usually Druid and Celtic Reconstructionist are not things you would necessarily associate with each other. And that was awesome for me because it provided a structure that I still use today for how to approach spiritual practice. Because Celtic Reconstructionism, even though it has this sort of bad reputation as it only focused on the ancient past, the whole purpose of it was always to sort of look at all the evidence we had, archaeological, anthropological, folklore, cultural. There's a big emphasis on, if you're trying to connect to a culture, you need to connect to that culture, not just to the surface bits that you like. So the language and the music and the food and the art and all of it is like a package deal. But the second thing that ended up being good for me in the long run was through that, I wrote my first book, which started out as a project for that particular group and then kind of took on a life of its own. And that, of course, was self-published because that's, how a lot of people honestly get into writing is you put out some self-published work and start to slowly build a little bit of traction and then move from there into traditional publishing, which is what I ended up doing. I had a couple self-published books come out and then I was approached by a very, very, very tiny niche publishing company, which is no longer around, but this would have been in 2011, 2012. And they asked me if I would do a children's book, believe it or not, on the fairy faith. And at the time, my kids were my oldest kid was right in the age range that the book was aimed at. I was like, well, this is perfect. I'll just write it like I was writing it for my own kids. It was like a year after that, I think, that I approached Moon Books and submitted to publish through them, which ended up being my book, Where the Hawthorn Grows. My oldest moon book, which no one ever talks about, is sunk into obscurity. But that was specifically aimed more at Druidism. I do not consider myself a Druid any longer at this point, kind of in my life. But, credit where it's due. That is where I got my start, particularly with writing. Then it just kind of went from there. It turned out that I apparently have a knack for writing nonfiction that takes what can be fairly complicated academic material and makes it easily understandable for a wider audience, or at least according to what people tell me.
I would have to agree with that wholeheartedly. Yes.
That makes me happy because I'm really lucky the position that I'm in. I have a lot of access to a lot of academic material, which I, fully acknowledge most people don't have. And obviously you can't know better if you don't have access to these sorts of sources. And so my view has always kind of been that because I have this access, I should share that with people and get that material out to the audience it needs to be getting to, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's important. You can tell that it's absolutely just who you are, that it's a passion for you. You want to share. I get that. As soon as I learn something, I'm like, I'm going to go tell 20 people. And it's very obvious, it's very apparent that you can't explain things simply without having a really deep understanding of the topic. That is something that I've encountered over and over again. And it's very apparent that you have a deep understanding of everything that you write about. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you. Like I said, I try, and it was something particularly with the more like Celtic language culture and Irish end of things that I really started to see the difference between like what was kind of out there for the pagan in particular public versus where things were at in academia, and like what different people who really dedicate their lives to studying this stuff were saying. It's such a huge difference. And again, like this isn't a criticism of anyone. I think it really does come down to what resources people have access to. And if you're pulling from like those awful pagan books of the 1990s as sources, of course you're going to then pass on information because you're trusting that that source is genuine, even when it actually isn't. But you have no way to know that. The whole goal is to like make that more open to people and get that information out, so that it's not stuck in academic books that people just don't have access to.
Right. And in the 80s and 90s, we had, well, in the 90s more than the 80s, we had messenger boards and documents you could download and whole websites. And I was researching on the message boards too. I was in the chat groups and that sort of thing because it was so hard to find resources in our local library. And the internet was so dang slow. I was
Yep.
literally on Ask Jeeves and, waiting 5 minutes to download something. So,
Yep.
yeah, there's no shame, but when you know better, you do better, I think.
Right. Right. And it's funny to me, at least. This is not a funny haha thing. It's more of a funny, like, I should be crying about it thing. But, like you were saying, in the 90s, our access was so limited because the internet was kind of in its infancy in a lot of ways. And it was really hard to find information. You kind of had to know what you were looking for before you were looking, which defeats the purpose if you are trying to learn new things about a subject. And then we hit like a sweet spot in like the 2000s where the internet was amazing. You could find stuff. It wasn't too hard to search. And then we went the exact other way, where now the internet, it's very difficult to research online because there's too much out there. And a lot of what is out there, we've circled back to it being like super questionable. Stuff gets repeated without people checking it. AI has made it 100 times worse because now, for anyone who isn't familiar with how AI works, when you ask, like, if you go on an AI, chat GPT or whatever, and say, like, tell me 10 bullet points about the Morrigan, that AI is going to search and scrape any information that mentions the Morrigan, whether it's fiction, whether it's a person's personal gnosis that is just their own thoughts and opinions or whatever, and whatever public nonfiction sources are out there. And so you get this sort of weird mishmash of kind of everything and anything. And I've run across some things that are clearly wrong, but I can see where they're coming from in being wrong. I'm like, well, that's obviously from like the Dresden Files or a source like that, but then it gets repeated and then it's included in nonfiction sources, and it's just a huge mess. It's so bad right now.
It really is hard. It's almost funny. I was having a conversation with one of my students, and they were doing some research for their assignments, the things that they're supposed to be learning. They asked, how do I discern? People don't list sources in any case. And sometimes you come across a story that feels so true and feels so beautiful that you're just instantly enamored by it. I remember one of the stories about the Morrigan. Again, it seemed wonderful, and it was wonderful. It had elicited an emotional response in her. it made her feel closer to that pantheon, to that deity. And so I think that's a good thing, but we have to be discerning because that was
Yep.
absolute, it was totally fabricated. It ended up
Yep.
being that author's own personal, it was just their own belief system. It can be really difficult to sift through that. I agree.
Yeah, it is really difficult. And I also, think that we struggle as a community with this idea that something has to be old to be legitimate. Because, like you said, you can run across stuff that's modern stories, modern interpretations, people's experiences that are profoundly moving. The important part is just that context. And, like you said, that's a lot of times what gets left off. And, because I'll say this all the time, all across my social media, that there's nothing wrong with believing something that's a new idea. You just have to acknowledge it's a new idea because a lot of times what happens is people try to put things out like, oh, this is ancient, legitimate belief, like that somehow makes it more valuable. And then that's where the confusion comes in,
Right.
you know? And to me, that's where the issue is. Like, believe whatever you want, if you want to believe that Morgan wears like, pink leg warmers and, has little rainbow kittens following her around, whatever makes you happy. I wouldn't personally agree with it, but
I just got
that's
anxious. Like that just made me anxious, actually. I was like, oh my gosh, no, never. Like, why
right.
would
Right. Like because there are people do have some really particular ideas about certain
Yeah.
things. But as long as you're acknowledging, like, this is how I see her, this is how
Yes.
I interact with her. And again, like, I wouldn't personally agree with it. If someone said that to me, I'd probably be like, okay, choices are being made. Okay. But when I run across people who are like, well, she was historically understood as this, very gentle, loving mother goddess who was then warped by Christianity, that's when we have a problem.
Hold
That's when
on a
I'll
minute
kind of,
now.
yeah, that's when I'll step in and be like, yeah, no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely okay to say, this is my perception. This is how this shows up for me. I'm not saying, I'm the end all be all. Give a little bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of substance there, just a little bit of background. I agree.
Yeah. And I think people just also need to be aware that like other people don't have to agree with you or accept your ideas or thoughts or opinions. That doesn't invalidate them for you. Because that's another thing I run across a lot is people act like, well, I had a vision of the Morgan where she said that she's actually, a loving mother goddess, whatever. But then they put it out there like everyone has to agree with this now. Everyone should understand her this way. And again, I think there's just a line between like what's perfectly fine for you as an individual to believe or do with whatever versus like what is not okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And I will just say this up front. I'm always really cautious of anyone who says they're like speaking for a deity, or that they're channeling messages for the world from a particular deity or being. That I get like hives when that happens. I'm allergic to it.
Same. Same. I'm not doubting that they believe that's happening or even that it's
Yeah.
happening. It's just that kind of encroaches into the territory of manipulation, and I'm
Yeah,
not super comfortable with that. So,
exactly. Because there is that push behind it of like, if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong and you're failing to connect to like the genuine whatever. I actually run into this most often with fairies
oh,
because
okay.
there's so many modern understandings and interpretations of fairies and who and what they are. And there are some people with particular approaches that do involve a lot of like channeling messages, which no criticism, I have nothing against that, but it gets put out there like everyone else is wrong and this is the one real truth. And that I think is a problem. We
Oh
need to, as a
yeah.
community, we need to be a little more aware that that's a problem.
Or zoom out a little bit. Maybe your ancestors were from Northern Ireland and you have this understanding of these concepts. And you can also recognize that there's going to be an entire the south of Ireland has a completely different context for this. And so some of the perceptions are going to be different. And I have difficulty when people say that they're the end all be all. That's, I think, part of
Yeah.
why your writing is so refreshing, and I love every year what is the one misinformation thing that went viral that you posted about? Oh my gosh.
Oh, there's been the two biggest ones. I think I had one about Yule and like winter solstice traditions, and I had one I think about Bialchina. Beltane.
It was
Sorry, I
definitely
default to
Dieltana.
Irish.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, that both of those ended up getting a lot of traction. I had one on Easter eggs too that people have very strong opinions about.
There's so many debates, and it's fun when they're respectful and, not limiting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's kind of circling back to what we were just talking about. People will have very strong opinions about certain things, and sometimes something is based in misinformation. But if it still has a lot of value for you, that doesn't mean you have to stop believing it or stop whatever. Just sort of acknowledge, like, oh, this is a newer idea. Because beliefs evolve, folklore evolves, spirituality evolves, like all of that. None of that is like fixed in amber, like a poor mosquito that had bad timing, where we have to be like, well, this is what they believed 200 years ago. So now this is what everyone believes forever going forward. That's just not how these things work, but it is important to sort of acknowledge that evolution, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think our perspective of deity, it reflects onto deity and back onto us as well. And so we kind of walk together with this refracting lens, and it evolves, and there's nothing wrong with that. So beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. I've said in a couple of the books that I wrote that, like, when I first started, say, honoring the Morrigan, or I first started connecting to Macha or whatever, I would have one particular understanding, like, this is what I'm going into this with. And then as you learn more and you get more information and you read more stories, hopefully that's going to change that understanding, and in a good way. But it's, the more foundation you have to build off of, the more opportunity you have to go from there, instead of having this like, well, when I started 25, 30 years ago, I understood her this way, so therefore I have to always understand her that way. And nothing can ever interfere with that. It's, if you're not growing, you're dying, I guess, is to summarize my viewpoint.
Yep, totally. Your new book, the Pantheon series on Pantheon the Irish with Moon Books.
Yep, that one. Yep, that one comes out the end of this month. Yeah.
That is a huge undertaking. It's a huge task navigating Irish mythology, culture, spiritual traditions in a way that's, again, accessible, but also deeply respectful. You've written about this many different times. It has a lot of new concept. What inspired you to write this book at this time?
Yeah, that variety was intentional. I was trying to make sure it didn't repeat, because I have a book, Irish Paganism, where I talk a lot about some of like the core base beliefs. And then I have a book called Irish Gods and Goddesses, which is effectively like a little mini dictionary, just focusing on those deities. So when Pantheon the Irish came around, and it's effectively, the first part is talking about history and beliefs and practices, and the second part is a dictionary style approach, like gods, goddesses, and spirits. I was a little nervous how I was going to do that, because like I've already written about this, particularly the Irish gods and goddesses, the dictionary style portion of it, several times, and I don't want it to just be repeating. Like, people who buy this book shouldn't feel like they got, a bad deal because they'd already read a lot of this in another book. So I really kind of did a research deep dive and tried to tackle things that I hadn't covered in other places, tried to get different information about the gods and goddesses than kind of what I'd already put out there. I wrote Pantheon the Irish because my editor asked me if I was interested in doing it. I had written a book called Pantheon the Norse for Moon Books a few years ago, which I'm really proud of. That one. That one was probably my most research heavy book, and I really got to deep dive on a lot of cool things related to heathenry, Ausatru, Norse paganism, whatever we want to call it. And so when they were trying to expand the series and add more titles to it, my editor had approached me and asked if I would be interested in doing one on the Irish Pantheon. And it was that sort of like dual response. If there was part of me that was like, oh, this is so exciting, I definitely want to do this because I know it's a subject I can do really well for. But then there was the other part of me that was like, how do I do this without it being repetitive? Because it is a subject I've written about so much in the past. I think it ended up being a good challenge ultimately. And I think that it's a book that on its own would be helpful to people, but you could also combine it with those two other ones I mentioned and get like a much fuller, wider view of everything. So that was kind of how that came about.
Well, you were successful.
I'm glad you liked it.
I really did enjoy it. One of the points that you highlight early on is how regionally different regions of Ireland hold distinct traditions and interpretations. And that is so important. Can you talk about why regional variation is so important when we study Irish paganism?
Sure. And this is definitely one of those things that, like, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, I would probably have a very different opinion on, because it's something that I've realized as the years have gone by and as I've, studied all this more and more. A lot of times when we talk about Irish paganism or Irish mythology, everything gets kind of lumped together or homogenized. So when we talk about the Morrigan, we talk about her as she was widely or generally understood. And the more I was kind of digging deep into all this stuff, the more I realized that, like, well, this might be true. This statement might be true here in Meath or Roscommon. But then if we go to this other area, actually we'll find that this is very different over here. So I'll just give you one sort of general example. And I think this adds to a lot of confusion around the Morrigan that people struggle with, which is why I'm using it as an example. If you read the Tonbridge Cooley in the Ulster Cycle, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, you'll find that there are actually multiple versions out there. So if you were a scribe in, wherever, Wexford, and you were copying down the Tonbridge Cooley, you would write it based on the understanding that existed of it in your area where you were. Whereas if you were writing it in, say, Donegal, you would write it based on your understanding there. And so what we find is that in one version, it's the Morrigan doing certain things. It's the Morrigan who goes and warns the brown bull to flee, that Maeve is coming to try to take him. It's the Morrigan who appears and incites and does all this other stuff. But then if you go to that other version, it's actually Bive, because Bive was the primary goddess in the more northwestern parts of Ireland, whereas the Morrigan was more well known in other areas, particularly the central. And then when we get into parts of Connaught, she was like the primary goddess there. And I think that when you look at that and then you start to understand, like, okay, they have the same stories, but they're putting in whoever their primary war goddess would have been, because obviously if you live in that area and that's the main war goddess that everyone acknowledges and talks about, of course she's going to be the main character in that story and not this other goddess who's known somewhere different. And I'm just throwing that as one small example, but sometimes the beliefs are even pretty extremely different. So like you can go to one area of Ireland and they're going to say, never ever bring a hawthorn inside the home because it lets the good folk come in and it's chaos and you don't want that. But then you can go 3-4 hours across the island and you'll find a place and it'll be like, oh no, you're supposed to bring it in. It wards them off. It'll keep the good folk out of your home if you have some hawthorn like above the door, above the lintel of the door. And people will see that and then try to reconcile those two different beliefs instead of just respecting that, like, no, these are regional variations. They believed this here and they believed something different somewhere else, and neither is right or wrong. There doesn't have to be ultimately like one truth involved. It's just, this is different beliefs in different places.
Yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
so
I don't want to rant too long about that.
No, that reflects back to our earlier conversation too. A few centuries ago, someone probably had their own personal paradigm that they decided to tell everybody about, and then it shifted things.
Yeah. So there's a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, which a lot of people like to recommend and talk about. And I don't dislike, I think you have to take it with a big grain of salt if you are going to read that one. But one of the things that's particularly fascinating for me today, as someone who engages with modern folklore around these things, is that when they did the interviews in the first part of the book, he just went around and interviewed people that were willing to talk with him. And so you see such a fascinating range of ideas. One of the people he interviews is very adamant that the fairies, that the good folk come from the stars, that's kind of their origin point. And, someone else talks about them as being warded off by salt. That just like everyone will talk about, they can't be around iron. This person was like, oh, salt, you can't put salt in food offered to them. And if salt's around, they won't be there. And these were clearly like either very, very, very localized beliefs or just personal opinions. And to see sort of how wide that range is when I think in our modern period, we tend to view everything in the past as like everyone agreed on everything.
Yeah.
You know, when we try to study older things, we're like, well, what did people believe in like the 17th century in Scotland about fairies? And we expect it to be just one simple answer. And instead, we find out, no, actually, it was really complicated because there was widespread belief, but then there was also like personal opinions and ideas. And some of the stuff that's been passed on even is things that were originally personal opinions, you know, and then they get shared and kind of grow from there, which I personally find like super fascinating. It's one of the things I love about studying this subject is that there's always something new to learn. There's always something new you can uncover because there's just so much out there.
Oh, there's so much out there. And it's such an interesting thing to kind of traverse. You're tiptoeing along and finding these different perspectives, these different threads, and then wonderful authors like yourself weave them together. It's
I
fascinating.
try. I try. I do. I've started in a lot of my books. I'll open with sort of a, you know, I don't want to say a warning, but I'll just tell people like, if you're expecting simple, straightforward answers on this subject, you're not going to find them. It's just not possible, you know? So, in my books, particularly the fairy books, but some of the others as well, I'll be like, just be prepared. There are things that are going to be contradictory in this. And that doesn't mean they're right or wrong. That doesn't mean, you know, whatever. It just be aware going into this subject that we don't always have answers. I talk a lot about genealogy with the Irish gods because everyone always wants to know, like, well, who was this god's mother or who was this goddess's father or whatever. And it's like, well, brace yourself because the Tuatha Dé Danann, their genealogy is a mess. It's like a little ball of yarn that, you know, is just all over the place and tangled and contradictory. And again, like in this one area, they might have believed and written down that, oh, the Dacta's children are these specific people. But then if you go to a different area, they're going to say, well, actually, his children included these other ones as well. And it's just a glorious mess, is what it is. And you have to go into it understanding that.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You've written extensively about the fair folk, about the Dina Shi, which, by the way, I have to admit that I had to ask you how to pronounce that before we started because, oh my
That's
goodness, I'm
okay.
getting
That's
better.
okay.
How do they intersect with the Irish pantheon, and what would you say to a modern practitioner about how they should understand them?
Sure. So this is definitely one of those messy, muddy kind of subjects because what we have when we look at the oldest sources is this idea that the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Irish gods, sort of came into Ireland. They were not native to it. They were not indigenous to Ireland, according to the myths and the stories. They came in and then they lived there for a while, and then humans came in, and this agreement was reached where the humans would have the surface of Ireland and the good folk would go and have everything beneath the surface, which is more of an analogy than literal, but they would go into the She. And the She are these particular hills that are associated with the other world and with otherworldly beings. And where this gets messy and complicated is the Tuatha Dé Danann going into the She did not create the She. They, you know, were not like the founding members of that. They joined the population that was already there. And so then it gets very confusing because we have beings like Manan and MacLear, who was the king of the otherworld before the Tuatha Dé Danann went into it. We actually have a whole myth about how he helped them by sort of telling each of them which fairy hill they were going to live in, and also teaching them things like how to pass invisibly to humans, like stuff we would associate with fairies today. And when we kind of look at that, people will get this like mental conflict, mental dissonance about, well, then how do they fit into this? And the answer ultimately is that they kind of ended up largely as like the kings and queens of the otherworld of the She. So every individual She, every individual otherworldly hill has its own ruler associated with it, has its own folklore and stories fixed on that particular being. So Shean Broga Newgrange is Angus Machog, and Nachanya in Limerick is Anya. It's literally named after her, so that one's kind of easy. But they're just examples of like, okay, this particular location is now very strongly connected to what was probably originally a god or goddess that was connected to that same area. With that, when we were just talking about how everything so regional, you know, you would have had these deities who were mostly known in particular places. Well, now they're understood as like the king or the queen of the fairies there, or, you know, strongly connected to them in that way. And So you end up with this sort of layered concept where you have the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Irish gods, which are understood as gods, but then you also have the Aishi more widely, the beings of the otherworldly hills, the otherworld, which can include the Tuatha Dé Danann, but also include a lot of other things that were there beforehand and are not what we would consider like the old Irish gods. I hope that makes sense because, like I said, it's a
It
very
does.
messy subject.
Well, it is a difficult subject to broach. It's a difficult subject to research. I mean, oh my goodness. You're going off of manuscripts and encounters and things like that. There's so much information, and drilling it down and going to the sources is even more confusing. So I am
Yes,
grateful for you. I
it
mean,
often is. Yes.
but I love your approach. There's
Thank
a
you.
lot of romanticism of Irish fairy lore in pop culture and the neo-pagan community, and then there's a lot of not necessarily fear-mongering, but vilification. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you regularly encounter, and how do you approach correcting them? I know how you approach correcting things, and it's gently, which is appreciated, but
I do try because I always operate from a place of like, if people don't know better, if this is the information they've run across, then this is the paradigm they're working from. And unfortunately, as we've already established multiple times throughout this conversation, a lot of what's out there is misinformation. And it is often misinformation that either started in the Victorian period or started in the 1990s and almost always outside of Ireland. You know, if people in Ireland have a belief, then that's obviously a legitimate Irish belief, whatever it happens to be. But when you have people outside that culture who were writing about things or creating things in a lot of cases, then it just gets very, very messy and complicated. And, you know, I think that that is something that I always try to be aware of. People are not like intentionally trying to forward misinformation. So when I'm in a position to correct things, I always try to do it as nicely as possible. I do find that people don't always receive it that way. Which I also, to be fair, I do understand when you have a very deeply held belief because you read, a book on Witta in the 1990s. It's a horrible book, by the way. I'm sorry to anyone who likes it, but it just is. And then someone comes along and says, actually, there never was an Irish god of death named Beltane, because that's just weird. I would never say it's just weird to the person, but it is a strange concept. But they've been practicing with that and they've believed that for, decades. Obviously, they're not going to be thrilled to
mm.
find out that book that they love so much, that information that they've been working from is just made up by that author. So I always try to be really nice about it as much as I can. And I try to provide sources for what I'm saying, because I don't think we ever accomplish anything when it's just like, well, I disagree because this is what I think. And you're like, well, I disagree because this is what I think. I mean, we're both perfectly entitled to our own opinions on things. But when something isn't an opinion, and I'm just going to keep picking on Witta because it's a book that I don't think most people can actually defend. So, no offense to anyone who does like it, but it's just a really awful book. There was a lot of things that got mentioned in that book that are just factually incorrect. The author has a whole thing in the beginning about how there were no female druids because they were not allowed to train. And so the female druids were the ones that became the witches somehow, never really explained how. Whereas the male druids were, horrible and patriarchal and ruined everything for everyone. And like that's an example I use because that's something where I can say definitively, well, we have these sources that talk about female druids in Ireland. We know that there were female druids, maybe not as many as the male, at least in the stories we have, but we know they existed. There's evidence for them. So I'll usually try to take that angle with it and be like, well, we have these examples. I recently on social media had run across something talking about how leprechauns were invented by the Irish American diaspora. And that's one of those half truths that just makes more confusion because, yes, the sort of modern idea of the leprechaun, it first appears in print in the writing of an Irish American writer in New York, the, little fairy cobbler, old man idea.
I didn't know that. That's amazing. Now I'm gonna go off on a
Yeah.
tangent.
Yeah, and I love stuff like that. Like I have a big passion for finding like where did this belief start? What's the first example we have of this? And what's its possible origins? But that all said, leprechauns do exist in Irish mythology. They appear in an 8th and an 11th century manuscript very differently from the modern version. They're these sort of like water sprites. They're about the same size as modern leprechauns are seen to be. So about 18 inches, foot and a half a meter tall. But outside of that, there's a king, there's a queen, there's a bard, there's all these like common folk leprechauns. They basically lived like in a society just like the humans of the time, except they're these, small magical people, basically, and no emphasis on making shoes or pots of gold. But that concept across time sort of evolved and morphed into the leprechaun that we have today. When the subject came up, I was like, well, it is true. Yes, the modern version, but the misinformation part, like, no, we do actually have, and I named both of the manuscripts it was in, and they're really cool stories. Actually, I think everyone should read them anyway, but I can kind of point to like, well, this is where this starts. Like, you can find this for yourself. You don't have to just rely on me. Go for yourself and read this, and you'll see like how they appear and that they are called leprechauns and etc. So anytime I run across misinformation, that's usually my approach, is to be like, well, this is actually where this is coming from. The misinformation is coming from, but this is sort of the wider picture, and this is what we have in the older sources or the folklore for the most part. And like I said, I try to be nice about it. Every now and then I think I do maybe fail a little bit.
I
But
mean, sometimes it is infuriating.
there's been a couple points where I ran across memes, and I feel a little petty doing this, just like full disclosure, but I'll take the meme and then photo editing, and I'll cross stuff out and like
Like
add
with the red
corrections.
pen.
Yeah, basically. There was one recently about Trows, which is Orkney and Shetland folklore. And I do honestly believe it was AI. I don't think a human wrote this, but it was, and I'm saying this as someone who has studied this subject at this point for decades. It's not often I'll read something where I'm like, I genuinely have no idea what this person is talking about. Like, this is so wacky. Trows are basically sort of the Orkney and Shetland version of the good folk, of fairies. And so they're thought to be generally human in appearance. They like to wear gray. So they're sometimes called the gray neighbors, which I think is cool. Hence, I'm throwing that out there. But they will steal humans for various purposes. They'll leave behind changelings. Usually the humans are stolen for the typical fairy purposes of either they want them to marry one of the Trows, so they kidnap the person, or they need a wet nurse is a common one, or it's a musician and they just really like music and they usually let those people go again. Midwives, the same thing. So this is sort of just like the context for this. And yet the meme was talking about how like the Trows are these vicious monsters with like claws and fangs, and they steal people and eat them. And I was like, what is happening? This is unhinged.
How can you be so wrong about so many things?
Right. Like it literally, like almost everything they were saying, they were talking about how Trows are creatures that were believed in by the settlers of Orkney. And I'm like, I don't even understand how to parse that sentence, because Orkney was historically Celtic language speaking area, and it was colonized by the Norse in the 11th or 12th century. I mean, it was quite a while ago. So I'm like, I don't know who settlers even means in this context. It was just such a bizarre way to phrase it. That's why I'm like, I think this is AI, because this doesn't even really make any sense. And they had AI images, and yeah, so that stuff got crossed out, and I added text to be like, no, this is almost every single thing in this infographic is just bizarrely wrong. And stuff like that, I admit I'm not always as nice about, just because it's very frustrating.
I mean, I welcome it, and I really like your viral post, because I like
Thank
how,
you.
I think I forget who it was, and it was like happy posting Morgan Daimler's perspective season for, but I'll
Yeah,
have to tag you. It was so funny. And happy Morgan Daimler correcting everybody's season to all who celebrate. I
yeah,
lost my mind. It's true though. I mean, it's welcome because it's so important. Gently say, well, you can only be gentle for so long, right? But
yeah.
saying, hey, I'm not sure where this came from, but this is my research. And I also know, because I've been following you for some time, that if for some reason something were to come up, if you were to have something pointing to your perspective being incorrect, you would be like, oh, this is so cool. I used to believe this, but now I found this.
That's happened a few times where I will make a bold statement and then someone will be like, actually, if you look here and be like, oh, what do you know? Look, actually, I was wrong. Okay, that's fine. I had actually years ago, I don't know why I keep saying actually, sorry. It's my word of the day, I guess. I had written this whole thing at one point. I think it's actually in one of my books too, maybe my Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fairfolk, where I was like, the idea of fairies rescuing abused children is coming from urban fantasy. I know exactly which series it comes from. And I do know there is a series that's one of the main premises of the series and that started in, I think, 1990. But I was really adamant, like, this is not a thing. We don't have any evidence for it. And then I was researching, I think, about the fairy courts at a later point, years later. And I ran across an article that had been in 1859, I think it was, Edinburgh Journal, in which the author talks about how the two fairy courts, the unseelie court, the, quote unquote bad fairies, would steal unbaptized babies, but the seelie court, again, quote unquote good fairies, would steal children who were being mistreated. And I was like, well, what do you know? Look at that. I was wrong. And I went on my social media and I shared it and told everyone, like, listen, if you listened to me before, I appreciate that, but I was wrong. So let's get the correct information out there.
That's all we can do.
Well, like you said, earlier, it's like that Maya Angelou quote, if when you know better, do better. So, and everyone is wrong sometimes. So I would never trust someone personally who was like, I am never wrong. I am never open to correction, because it's just life. And,
Absolutely.
sometimes it's not even like you're working from the best information you have at the time. And then there's some breakthrough with something, or they find some new archaeological site and the interpretations change, the views change. And I think we all have to be open to adapting.
Oh, absolutely. And you've clearly indicated that you are.
I get very passionate about this topic.
Yeah. Oh, no, I love it. I was so excited for this conversation. I honestly, I told you I was more than a little bit nervous because I was going to try very hard not to appear as if I'm fangirling. So
Fine. I get more
definitely on me.
confused with fangirling than anything else, because like I said, like we were talking about a little before we started the interview. To me, I don't see myself, I guess, the way other people see me. I'm just a nerd
But
with a passionate interest in, some might even say, hyper focus on particular subjects, which is Irish mythology and fairies. And to me, like, I love the opportunity to share this information with people, and I could talk about this forever. And I just feel enormously geeky when I'm doing it.
well, that's my favorite part. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's the only reason.
Yeah,
I'm like,
I
I
love
am
it.
a nerd and I love information. I'm an information whore, if you will. But
See, you and I are going to get along really well. I'm right there with you.
we have hungry minds, right? We can't
Yep.
control it. That's okay.
I like to tell people I have the world's most boring hobby, because my hobby, which I do, well, I write fiction for fun, to be fair, which is less boring. But my hobby, which is what I do, like, for really no recompense, I just do it because I feel very passionate about it, is translating Old and Middle Irish. I literally learned a whole language because the existing translation that's in the public domain, because it's the Victorian era one, is so bad. And I had so much anger towards this man who's been dead for like 100 years, this translator, out of sheer spite. I was like, I am going to learn this so I can read it for myself and correct all this misinformation that's out there because of this one translator in particular. That is kind of what I do in my free time, which is honestly the nerdiest possible thing.
No,
Like,
fight can be
trans
a hell of a motivator.
I highly recommend spite as a motivator to everyone. Like, I think it's very underestimated
Do you
how
have
valuable
Capricorn
it is.
placements? Like what?
I don't,
You
ironically
don't?
enough.
That's
So,
surprising.
since you brought it up, just on a quick aside, my chart is what's called a bundle chart. So
Oh,
basically, I have 4 signs in Libra, 3 in Scorpio, 1 in Sag, and 1 in Virgo. So it might be the Virgo
oh,
coming
it's the
through.
Virgo. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating that you have a bundled chart because,
Yep.
the level of hyper focus. You're here doing what you're supposed to be doing because, shining the light on all of this wonderful information.
I'm trying. And like I said, I do it not just for myself, but because I know that people just don't have access.
Yep.
If you are looking for free resources, the public domain translations are going to be your go-to, which I understand. And they're just awful, most of them. Because again, people don't realize, unless you really get into this subject, if you were a translator in the 1890s, then if you felt like a certain passage was just inappropriate for your audience, you just wouldn't include it, which is what this particular translator that I have a grudge against would do. He would just be like, well, this entire lengthy passage, which is actually pivotally important to the mythology, is squicky and involves like body parts. So we're just not going to do that at all. We're just going to skip it. Yeah.
That stresses me out, honestly. So I'm glad that you're doing that work. So with the very
Thank you.
old, like those texts are ancient. Some in their, I mean, most in their original language. What drew you? That's what drew you to the language side of the work because spite. I love this. What drew you to the
Yes.
language side of this spite?
Spite. Yeah, literally spite.
I would like
Well,
to
I've
rebrand passion. Passion drew you to that because it's so.
passionate spite.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, no, I do have some modern Irish. I've been trying to learn that for a long time. I am dyslexic, so don't ask me to spell anything in any language. That presents a bit of an extra challenge with the Irish because it is phonetic in its own way, but you have to understand the rules that it's working with, and my brain doesn't always like that. So I can read it better than I can speak it is kind of where I'm going with a lot of this. But the old and the middle Irish, yeah, basically what got me into it was I was working on my first book on the Morrigan back in, I think, 2014, Pagan Portals, the Morrigan. And I was comparing the better 1983 translation of the Kapmatura with the public domain Whitley Stokes, who's the man I hate version of the Kapmatura. And I noticed that each of them didn't translate certain things, but I noticed that there would be passages where the translations were very different between the two. And so I started to get real suspicious then, like what does it actually say? Like which one of them is correct when they're saying things that they can't both be the same. And the Kapmatura in particular, we only have one existing manuscript of it. So the majority of Irish manuscripts, for anyone who's not familiar with this, I'm going to assume that's most people, we usually have multiple versions. So like that example I gave earlier with Bive did it here and the Morgan did it here with the Tombo Cooley. It's because we have many versions of the Tombo Cooley. For whatever reason, the Kapmatura, which in my opinion is probably the most important myth about the old Irish gods that we have, only survived in one single manuscript. And so that is the source everyone works with. It's just that. There is no other alternate version. There's no, this translation says this, but this text over here says something else. So when I know there's only one text they're working from and they're both coming out with very different paragraph translations for whatever, something is clearly not right happening here. So that was my motivation. I was like, I started trying to learn it. And luckily for me, even though it is considered a dead language, like Old or Middle English would be, there are a good number of resources out there. And there are quite a few books that you can get to help learn it. And there's some online material as well. And when I started working on doing the translations myself, was when I realized like, oh, this is actually a considerable problem. It's not just this one author that I can't stand, this one translator I can't stand. It's other places as well. And sometimes the difference in the way things are translated really is pivotal for how you understand a story. For example, the Dinhentis, which are place name stories in Ireland, there's one for Tuatha. Tuatha is a goddess. She's associated with a particular hill. And in the common translation that's out there for the story, it says that she encountered the three sons of Simon the Druid or Simon Magus, and that they took her to wife, I think is how they say it, because it is a very old phrase. The actual translation does not say that. And I'm not going to use the word that's actually in there because I don't want this to get, censored or make the algorithms unhappy. But it was a non-consensual event. We'll say. And the text is explicit about that in the original Irish. The original language doesn't pull any punches for what actually happened, but the Victorian translator reworded it in such a way that if you read the English, you would think, okay, so she married these three guys. She then gets pregnant and flees to Ireland and dies giving birth, which is how a lot of the Irish creatrix stories happen. But that's a very different tone.
Yeah.
From she had a non-consensual experience with these three people and then fled. And if you're trying to understand her as a goddess, obviously one version of that story tells you a lot more about what's going on than the other one, which
Yes.
sort of distorts things. So yeah, spite is my motivator, is what it comes down to.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is infuriating when that happens, especially when it can change the tone of the perspective, everybody's
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, and I just think that a lot of people aren't aware of things like this, because how would you be if you can't read the original, you don't know what the original actually says, you're trusting the translator. So there's another example I'll give you from one of my favorite stories, how the Dagda got his magic staff, where basically the Dagda's son Kermit was having an affair with one of Lou's wives, and Lou did not appreciate this, understandably, and then decided to we'll just say take Kermit out of the picture. And the Dagda was so distraught over his son's death that he basically packs his body with like frankincense, myrrh, and herbs, and carries it, drags it around the world, trying to find a way to bring his son back to life. It's a great story, and it's short, and everyone should read it. But in the common public translation, you'll find it just says the Dagda, packed his son's body with frankincense, myrrh, and herbs, and then carried him throughout the world, trying to find a cure. And what the actual text says is the Dagda packed the body with frankincense, myrrh, and herbs, and then sought to use his knowledge and his magical skill to put the soul back in his son. And that's a very different, just all of that is very different. It tells you a lot more about the Dagda as a god, but also the difference between he just took this body and started wandering around, I guess, with his
Right.
fingers crossed, like hoping he could figure it out, versus the very intentional, like he was trying to use his magical skill and knowledge to bring the soul back into the body. To me, at least, very different ways you would
Oh,
take
yeah.
those passages. And that kind of stuff, I run across it a lot when I'm doing translations.
I mean, one version of that story lends to just unceremoniously yanking around, a body, dragging it around, and then another one is a quest,
Yeah.
a mission and searching for mysteries and trying to uncover magical ways yeah,
Yeah.
heck yeah, that's important.
Yeah. That the way that the common translation just cuts out the magical skill and knowledge, and specifically trying to put his soul back in his son, and just kind of it sort of is written like the Dagda's just hoping somehow this will work out.
Yeah.
He'll just wander around until he figures it out, I guess, as opposed to, like you said, it's a quest. He is on a mission to figure out how to use what he knows, and then he ends up running into three brothers, one of whom has a magic staff that revives corpses, which is very convenient for the Dagda. So
Yeah.
it became one of his most well-known tools.
You balance the scholarly approach or the scholarly rigor, I guess we could say, with spiritual authenticity really well when writing for both
Thank you.
academic and pagan audiences. Do you find that in your own spiritual practice, do you share your own interpretation of your own spiritual practice? And is it based mostly off of
I have
fact?
some fact-based problems, yes. Um, yeah, so it's funny you say this, actually, because I find that in academia, I have to be very careful because I am very open about my spirituality, which I don't think should be an issue.
I agree.
I know several academics who are very deeply Christian. I know one who's actually like a lay minister for the Anglican Church. I don't know what the correct term for that is, so I apologize, but like very deeply involved and very public about, the work he does with the church, which is fine. But then I know a lot of pagan and witchy academics who are very under the radar, because it's perfectly okay to be like super devoutly Christian, but if you're pagan, there's this immediate assumption that, like, well, maybe you're not as serious as other people are. But then with a lot of witches and pagans, I find that because I do the academic end of things, people will assume that what's the term? Armchair pagan. I've been called that multiple times, where people are like, well, clearly you just write about this. You don't actually practice anything. And it's ironic for me, because the whole reason I got into the academia was because of the practice, because I have had a lot of uncanny experiences in my life. I've had all sorts of things happen, and I wanted context for that. And to me, the answer then was the academia, and to dig into the folklore and to see other people believing the same kind of things. So yeah, I have this like really bizarre dual reputation, where to some people I'm too witchy and not academic enough, and to other people I'm too academic and not witchy enough. I'm like Schrodinger's academic pagan, I guess. But yeah, I do write in my book Traveling the Fairy Path, I think, is my most personal work, where I talk a lot about my actual spirituality, my actual spiritual practice, some of the random uncanniness that I've encountered over time. So I do try to talk about it, but I find that most people tend to focus primarily on the academic stuff with me. And that's sort of that's kind of the box a lot of people put me in, I guess
Mm.
is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, for me, the two can't exist separate from each other.
Yep.
Getting into Celtic Reconstruction is how I approach my spirituality, which at this point leans more into like early modern witchcraft with fairies kind of stuff. And I get a lot of value out of using the Reconstructionist approach and looking at all the sources and digging into all of that. But the reason I do all of that work is for the practical end, the actually, how do I do this? How do I create sacred space? How do I make a compass or a circle or whatever you want to call it? How do I create this connection? And actually, I can give you a really good example to kind of illustrate this. So when I was in Iceland in 1918, oh my God, I'm not that old, 2018, I am not a random immortal trying to pass as a human.
Sure, Jan.
Well, I definitely wasn't around in 1918. That I can say for sure. Promise. 2018. Sorry, that was such a weird slip. So in 2018, when I was in Iceland with several other people, including my friend Kat Heath, highly recommend her book, by the way. Everyone should check it out. We had a very weird group experience involving the Pleiades and timing of certain things and some like massive otherworldly stuff that was happening. And I afterwards felt really impelled, spiritually pushed to look at the Pleiades and create a ritual cycle based on that constellation at different points in the year, which is clearly just straight up personal gnosis,
Sure.
100% unfiltered spirituality. But because I'm me, I immediately started deep diving into the Pleiades around the world, how different cultures had understood it, the ritual significance it held in different places. And I found that that gave me so much more insight into what I was doing spiritually and what I was trying to create on a spiritual level and like how to do that in the most functional way. I can't picture myself doing things differently. I had this massive gnosis moment with the Pleiades and the ritual cycle and the good folk. And I immediately went to the research and actually found that there was a lot of basis for all of that. And then that gave me a place to build from to create based on the gnosis. So yeah, they're so completely intertwined for me. I really don't know how I would separate them out even.
And that doesn't decrease the validity of either of those approaches, either, in my opinion, because I think being drawn to something is very powerful. It's kind of validating when you go down these wormholes. That's part of the journey. That's part of the fun of uncovering this sort of thing, is the parallels that you uncover. And some of them can be huge and
Yeah.
groundbreaking. And like I said, validating.
Yeah. I think we should all be open to the idea when we have personal gnosis or spiritual things that it's okay to research. And if there's no basis to it, if it's entirely you, that is fine. It's just your modern thing. But if there is basis to it, if you find out actually there's a long history of people kind of having the same idea or thought or whatever, that just adds depth to it.
Mm.
I don't think it's a bad thing either way. If you disprove that it was done historically, great, it's a modern thing. Now you're working from there. But if you dig into it and prove like, no, actually there's a whole basis for this, then you have all that extra stuff to work with, and to springboard off of. So
I had to correct myself earlier too, because I didn't take into account your fiction, but you've written what, almost or approaching 60 books at this point?
I think I'm coming up on 60.
That's
I
an
have
incredible accomplishment.
I like to keep busy is what I tell people. Yeah, I am very privileged in certain ways. And we've mentioned because I have access to a lot of the academic material, because I can read Old and Middle Irish, I have access to the manuscripts. I can go directly to them when I am looking for something or trying to figure out what's going on with something. But on top of that, I am fortunate enough to be in a position at this point in my life where I am a full-time author. I don't have a day job. This is what I do. So it puts me in a position where I can write 3, 4 books a year, most years, and I can do other projects on top of that. And I fully acknowledge that if I was in the position I was in, say, 15 years ago, where I was still working I would not be able to do as much as I do. I would be much more limited in what I had time to kind of fit in. So, yes, it sounds like a really big number. And I acknowledge it kind of is a really big number. I've been writing for 15 years. And I just want to like publicly acknowledge that part of the reason for that and for how much I can get done is that I am lucky enough to be in this position that I'm in. The majority of people, particularly pagan authors, work full-time jobs and then write whenever they have time to write. And obviously your output is not going to be as high if you only have a limited amount of time to write. So I'm very grateful that I'm in the position I'm in at the moment.
Yeah.
We'll see with the economy how long this lasts, but at the moment.
Heard, but you've done so much good work for the community, for the neo-pagan community, for a scholarly community. I mean, it's important that you continue doing what you're doing. So I
Thank you.
think that,
I try.
yeah,
I
you're
try.
awesome.
And I do obviously I write the books. That's how I make a living. So yes, I would like them to sell. It'd be very helpful to me if people would buy them. But
Hint, hint.
it's well, my point being that like I'm not in this for the money though, and
Of
I do
course.
try to put out a lot of free resources as well. I have a YouTube channel, which is obviously free and it's not monetized. Just to be clear, I'm not making money from my YouTube at all. I do TikToks with like short little informational stuff. I was just doing a series on misinformation about the Morgan through TikTok. I have a blog which is free. I do have a Patreon, which obviously you can pay to join. But the majority of people who join my Patreon, I'm not necessarily encouraging this, but join it as free members because I do share all of my free content there as well. My viewpoint has always been that what really matters with all of this is getting that information out there and sharing that information, making it more accessible to more people. And the fact that I do make a career out of part of it, I appreciate that I'm able to do that. But I don't want people to feel like if you're interested in my work, your only option is to buy something. I do try to put a lot out there because I know what it's like when you can't afford it.
Yeah.
And nothing is getting cheaper out there these
No. Oh
days.
my gosh.
So yeah, so if these are subjects that interest you, more the fairies, to be honest, I don't do a lot with Irish mythology on my YouTube. My blog might be a better option for that. And then I try to do as much free as I can just to get that stuff out there. So just wanted to
Passionate.
mention that.
Yeah, no, you can
Yeah,
tell that. You can always tell. And this is kind of me being, okay, I'm going to put my snobby Capricorn hat on. I'm snobby about noble things, though, because I have a Libra rising. Let's just be clear. But you
that's
can
fair.
always tell when people approach things because you can tell what their intentions are, I should say. If you're really passionate about something, and you're doing it because that's it. That's the reason
Yeah.
why you're passionate about sharing it and sharing the things that you've uncovered. That shines through versus when you're just trying to, monetize something, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. No, and like I said, I do try. I try my best.
But you also have to make a living.
If
Making a living is important.
yeah, if we lived in a different world, a different setup where artists could just be supported, by generous patrons, it would be
Yeah.
amazing. But the reality is I'm a single parent. I have kids and they have very high expectations to have electricity and food,
Yeah.
because
They
kids
should
are weird
study
like that.
history more.
Yeah.
Come on. They'll be fine with some pottage and
Yeah.
some and a fireplace. I mean,
Yeah. We'll
yeah.
work it out. But yeah, so because my kids expect to have a standard of living that is at least equivalent to the lower end of their peers, we'll say, I do have to earn a living.
Yes.
And I appreciate that I can do that with my writing. Otherwise, I probably would just put everything out for free. But that's just, we don't live in
No.
a world at this point where that's a feasible option for
No.
me to do. And as we've established, I could go back and get a full-time job and then put things out for free, but then I don't have, it's that catch 22. Then I don't
Yeah.
have the time
Then you wouldn't have the
to
time to
do any
write
of
these
it.
brilliant masterpieces that we're waiting on. Absolutely. Oh, speaking of that, aside from Pantheon the Irish, are there any other new projects that you're currently excited about?
Always.
Always.
Yeah, so, and I should say before I say this that the way that the publishing industry works for people that aren't super familiar with like traditional publishing, not self-publishing, because as we've established here at my fiction, I self-publish it. That the time scale for that is really fast. I write it, I get it through editing, I get it through beta readers, I do revisions, I publish it. And usually that process, start to finish, only takes a few months. Traditional publishing does not work that way. So, whatever books I have coming out, like whatever books are coming out this year, primarily were written last year.
Oh,
Books
okay.
that I have, yep, books that it's usually a 12 to 14 month turnaround for traditional publishing, at least in my experience with my publishers. Books that I have coming out next year are books that I wrote this year. And then books that I'm under contract to write that I'll be working on from this point through next year won't come out now until 2027. And I realize that sounds like a very, very long explanation, but it's just important to understand when I explain this next part. So I have Pantheon the Irish out at the end of this month. I have a book called Tales of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Volume 1, which is a collection of my translation work. That's coming out in October, the end of October. And then I have a book out next April called The Fairy Courts, which is specifically looking at the evolution of the concept of the fairy courts, the Scottish sealing and unsealing courts, through folklore and history, how other cultures deal with it. Like the Irish, they don't have that concept. It's different. So I talk about that. And then how those have evolved through urban fantasy into modern pagan belief, because that's a subject I have a really intense interest in, sort of that feedback loop between folklore and fiction. Then I have in June a book on the wild hunt coming out.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
And then in July, I have Tuatha Dé Danann, Tales of the Tuatha Dé Danann Volume 2, which is more of my translation work. The first one is like shorter tales and miscellaneous bits of things. The second one is like some of the adventure tales. I have a full translation of the Kamaitara. I self-published the English version, but this includes the Irish and the English together. I did not do that in my self-published one because I could not get the rights, the copyright rights to the Irish. So very, very sadly for my eyesight, I got a digital copy of the original manuscript and transcribed it, which I never recommend to anyone because it's horrific. If you've ever seen the old manuscripts, like they are very difficult to read.
That's fascinating that you have all of that coming out. I cannot wait.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
actually like writing myself reminders to reach out to your publicist because I'm like,
yeah, send some.
that's one of the beautiful things about podcasting and reviewing is that you get kind of this insider's perspective on.
I have to admit, my absolute favorite thing about being an author is not any of the stuff you would expect. It's that people ask me to do endorsements now, and I get to read books like a year before they come out and get like that sneak peek. And I love that so much.
It's amazing.
Love it. Yeah, so I totally get what you're saying.
Oh, and well, it's just, I was actually thinking as you were explaining the process for me, and I think that we have several similarities. I feel like writing something and then a year later it being published would be excruciating for me because I would find more things that I would want to feature.
Yep. Yeah,
So,
it's a struggle. I also, despite appearances, have the patience of a toddler. So I get very frustrated with the publishing process because it takes so long. And also because I write the way that I write and the volume I write, I end up where like, okay, now it's time to promote Pantheon the Irish because that's coming right out. But I just finished writing a book on Macha. So my head is very in this like Morgan headspace, Macha headspace. And I have to remind myself like, oh no, this thing that I wrote last year like is coming out and I need to actually focus on that a little bit. Although I will say all of that is much better than academic publishing. Academic publishing is the worst. I wrote a piece for a book that came out through Peter Lang, which is an academic publisher. I wrote an article basically on the effect of fiction on belief versus folklore in fiction. And that was for a work. I submitted it in 2021 and it was just published a few
oh,
months ago. And I was dying. The whole 4 years, I was dying because I'm like, I just want people to be able to read it. And no, it took forever, absolutely forever. So when I get frustrated with like the pagan traditional publishing, I just try to remind myself it could be worse.
yeah,
It
yeah.
could be 4 years.
Levity. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh, that's excruciating. That's
I don't know how like full-time academics who only write for academic publishers, I don't know how they do it. I
oh
don't have the
yeah.
patience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, so
Yes.
I can't tell you how much I've appreciated our conversation today.
Oh, it's
And
been really fun.
it has been a lot of fun. I have a million questions for you, but I'm going to cut myself off here. So, for our listeners who are deeply drawn to Irish mythology or mythology in general and spirituality and don't know where to start, what's one book or resource that you'd recommend?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's hard for me ever to just recommend one,
Well, that's
one
okay. You can recommend
source.
a few.
Yeah, I think I always tell people if you're interested in Irish paganism, Irish witchcraft, Irish folklore, you want to go to Irish sources. I do my best to relay information that I know is hard for people to find otherwise. So I have my own sort of place in the scheme of things. But your best bet to start, I would say, is to look at some of the like the good quality Irish sources. Laura O'Brien comes to mind, Geraldine Burns has a book coming out on Irish magic. Ceildreacht is what it's called, that I again was privileged enough to read an early copy of. Highly recommend it. It's not out yet, but when it is out, it's amazing. Everyone should check it out. And Laura O'Brien, of course, has written about Irish witchcraft and Irish fairy faith as well. Specifically, there's an online site called Mythical Ireland, run by Anthony Murphy, where he focuses mostly on the like Neolithic stone sites and things, but he writes about them and includes a lot of the mythology and the folklore in ways that I think are really useful for modern practitioners. There's a folklorist named Michael Fortune. If Irish folklore's what you're into, he does videos as well as posts on social media. Highly recommend him. There's a page called Circle Stories, which takes sort of a broader view. They're Irish focused, but he will sort of compare and contrast with similar beliefs in other places around the world. And there's a ton of great folklore there. So those are all like off the top of my head, some really good options for people who are starting being interested in it. The manuscript material is really difficult. I'm not going to lie. And I do encourage people, if you're interested in the Irish gods, read their stories, read the myths in the oldest forms, even if you don't agree with them in the end, even if whatever, it gives you that background foundation, that understanding of like, these are the stories as they were being written down, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And I think it's really important to have that understanding to move forward from. But there's really no one source for that I can recommend. There is a great website. There is a great website. It's called Mary Jones Celtic Collective. And it's sort of a centralized location of links for Irish, Welsh, Scottish, like all sorts of material. But if you're interested in the Irish, you can click on the Irish texts page, and it's a whole list of the different myth cycles and English translations. I will, of course, say that the translations, just be cautious, as we've established. They're not always the greatest if they're in the public domain. I can, of course, say I have a book coming out with
Yes.
translations. My approach is to do it more literally. So it's not always the smoothest read for an English speaker, but it gives you a really strong feel of how these would have been told originally. I find that Irish manuscripts for English readers, modern English readers, are very repetitive. It'll be like Cullen said, I am putting this here so that no one will pass it until they've met my challenge, he said. Like they will have the dialogue tags at both ends of the sentence, or, things like that, where in English we're like, well, that looks weird and that's not how we do things. But I think reading them in that form and seeing how they would have originally been told, you actually get into like the rhythm of it, and you start to see like how the language worked, even if you're not speaking the language. Yeah, like I can get very ranty because I have a lot of passion about this, but
No, I love it.
I think literal translations have an important place in the scheme of things. And you will definitely get the non-Victorian censored version when you read my
Yay.
translations.
Yes, please. Let's
Like,
not gloss over any important details.
yeah, it's funny to me actually, because some of the stuff that gets censored, I'm like, I don't even understand why that. I mean, yeah, I guess whatever, it was a little risque for 1890, but not to a degree like in modern terms we'd be like, yeah, that's nothing. That's
Right. They were
that's
just showing
fine.
too much ankle.
Yeah, basically. It's a lot of ankle flashing going around. For sure.
Oh, I love
So my recommendations for places to start. Obviously, I won't be upset if anyone gets my books to start with, but definitely look at the Irish sources as much as possible. And if you're interested in Irish witchcraft and paganism, another thing I always say is at least make some effort to connect with the living culture. It's real and it's vibrant and it's there and it deserves to be respected. If you're going to worship the gods connected to that culture, at least have some awareness of like the history and the language. If not everyone I know is good at learning languages, and Irish tends to present problems, particularly for people, but you can at least make an effort, and even basic things, little things, learn about the food, learn about the music, learn about the history. I'm going to emphasize that because the history of Ireland is very messy and complicated and important. And, go from there. Because again, I'm such a reconstructionist. I realize I'm like giving you like 20 different things to look at. If you want to start, here's your 20
I'm
places to
thrilled by
start.
this. I knew it was going to be a difficult question. And as we spoke, I was like, oh, this is going to be a difficult question. They're going to have trouble with this, which is fine. But I think
I
that's
love
important.
difficult questions. Yeah,
I know
no, because it is important, and
it is.
I also think like, and the part of the reason I encourage people like look at different perspectives, look at people who disagree with me, that's fine. Look at the whole range of things, is because I do find a lot of witches and pagans, for whatever reason, fall into this very like tunnel vision. Like this is the one author or speaker or teacher that I trust, and I only go to them. And I get why, like sometimes we feel like we need to, if there's one person is trustworthy, stick with them. But there's so much diversity in opinions and concepts and ideas, and I think we just need to be careful to make sure we're staying open to that. Because otherwise, you'll never run across the fact that the elves actually did used to rescue abused children and have to correct yourself on social media. So
I
it's
mean,
important to be open to different perspectives.
thank you so much for today. I am really looking forward to getting a physical copy of your new book that's coming out, and the ones in the near future as well. I will link everything at the bottom for anybody who's interested. Thank you once again for coming on today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for letting me nerd out
Oh my
because that was
gosh.
that was really fun.
The pleasure was mine. I have been looking forward to this for weeks, so thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a great conversation.